I was always interested in kind of philosophical stuff, and very actually disinterested in religion. I sort of grew up very working class and very kind of left leaning. So, and religion growing up, it's the Church of England. It seemed very distant from the world that I was living in. But while I was on the road with bands and stuff like that, I just sort of became aware internally of a sense of actually a sort of desire for a kind of deeper sense of who I was as a human being. That was always my interest, was really, those very kind of philosophical, what makes us tick and why questions. And so I kind of ventured back into, and I'd always read, but you sort of lay things aside, especially when you're traveling with a band. You know what I mean? I mean, but I always read, but I sort of picked up, philosophical threads again. I mean, the sort of typical Nietzsche, all the stuff that you read when you're, existentially angsty, and, things like Camus and, Hermann Hesse, that whole spectrum of books. But being a little older, I sort of realized that a lot of the conversation had a kind of either engagement with or an antagonism towards religion. And I'd never really given religion any particular thought other than that's bullshit. I mean, that was really my take on it. And I thought, well, what do I think about all of that? And so I sort of began this very loose exploration of what I might think about religion and stuff. And I just started buying all kinds of like metaphysical and religious books, as you do, and I'm sort of, we're traveling around the world, we're on buses and planes and stuff. There's a lot of time to read. And so I just started to build up this kind of library of ideas, and I was like making notes and all this kind of stuff. And it's funny because I just published this sort of memoir, and I told a story in there that I didn't tell for a long time because I didn't have the language for it. Because, well, I'll tell you afterwards, but I met this girl when I was on the road who invited me to go home with her. and so I went home with her, and right as we began fucking, she asked me if I minded if she prayed for us. And I mean, we'd started, I mean, we hadn't started fucking, but it wasn't before we were in bed. She was on top of me, I was inside her. And she put her hands on my chest and prayed like a full-on, I didn't know at the time, but it was a full-on Jesus prayer, like an evangelical Jesus prayer. Well, it turned out that she was in a cult called the Children of God. But I didn't know that. I mean, because I'd never had anybody in my life who had any real religious relationship. I had one friend whose parents were very religious and his life seemed incredibly oppressive. But apart from that, except for school teachings and things, but to have someone of your own sort of peer group. And then in the morning, when I got up, I sort of walked into basically a cult Bible study. There's all these like hippie type Christian, and the Children of God, that was their big thing. They called them fishers for Jesus, and they were like, fuck guys to make disciple, or so. Oh, you're recording. I don't know how the profanity is, but
it's awesome. In fact, I'll cut this part out, but I was attacked by a flirty fishing, good-looking model from Slovenia for a cult.
Yeah. I mean, it's and the funny thing is that was never, it was weirdly not that big. I mean, perhaps she knew I was leaving town anyway. I was only in town with the band, you know what I mean? And I mean, in the morning, I mean, they gave me a Bible to take away, or some literature. I don't even remember. And they gave me a cassette tape of this guy, Jeremy Spencer, who used to be, I think, in Fleetwood Mac for a while, you know. And anyway, so that got me thinking about Christianity in a way that I'd never thought about Christianity before. And I just sort of went, well, that's an interesting take on Jesus. You know, and it wasn't like I went, oh, wow, you know, but it made me interested in, it sort of closed a distance between my perception of Christianity, and I just couldn't quite work it out. But so that kind of opened the door to an exploration of more kind of traditional religious things, and particularly Christianity. But this is all on my own. I mean, I'm not like conversing with anybody about it, other than one of my friends on the road. His wife was Japanese, and while we were on tour, his wife's entire family became Jehovah's Witnesses. So we had some conversations about that. And it was really funny because we wound up having lots of sort of philosophical conversations about religion, because, you know, when you're on tour with a band, there's no privacy, you know, everything you do is, you know, so if you're reading, you know, and I bought a Bible and started to read it and make notes, you know, and I'm like, this is insane, you know, but I found myself kind of, when I got, but what I was looking for was, I was looking for a way to be a richer human being. That's what I really wanted. And I think being on the road made me sense that it wasn't enough for me. Like the whole rock and roll thing, as great as it was fantastic. You know, no judgment. I have no regrets about it. But I wanted something else from my life. And what I really wanted was, I wanted to be a more integrated human being that was stronger and kinder and more philosophical and more open, you know, and so when I was thinking about Christianity, my sort of, I was like, well, you know, what's really interesting, and it was funny because it was only when I went through the Bible, but when I got to the Gospels, I found them really kind of weirdly wonderful, and I liked the stories. But what I took away from it was, I liked the very tangential interactions that Jesus had with people that gave them dignity. And I was like, I can relate to that. That's now, I didn't really, you know, that could have been Martin Luther King, it could have been Gandhi, you know, it could have been a lot of people, but it was in this context. And I think at the time, you know, in the late 70s, the beginning of the 80s, there was a lot of kind of spirituality in the air in a way, you know, because that's, you know, by the mid 70s, you know, you had the sort of first generation after the counterculture that was looking at things in a different way. And, you know, the kind of whole Jesus movement was starting to be real. I mean, you know, this is when Dylan made his, I mean, funnily, I bought Dylan's Slow Train Coming in Belfast, you know, where Pete lives, when I was on the road, when AC/DC played there, and I bought it as an album, you know, and I didn't even know why I was buying it, but, you know, I bought it. And I wasn't even that big of a fan of Dylan, but something about it, you know. So anyway, so I decided that I was going to try and be this person who was kind and didn't label people, and essentially that was my gospel. But my friends, who I told you I was going to see in California, what I didn't know was they'd become Christians while they were in LA. So when I got to LA, I suddenly found myself, A, left with all of their friends, and B, surrounded by people for whom Christianity and Jesus meant something entirely different and entirely other. And I just sort of, I embraced it and was embraced by them, and sort of took on as you. It was like, well, there's more to it than what because I was like, well, this is what it means, and they're like, yeah, well, that's not the whole story. You need to blah blah blah, and I'm like, oh, well, you guys seem to know. You've got the buildings and all that stuff. Okay, and so I think I said before, I sort of spent maybe like 10 years getting in to Christianity, and then 20 more sort of working my way out of particular iterations of it. Because what I was never looking for was, I was never looking for God. But God came as a part of the package deal of Christianity, right? It was all about God, and Jesus, Son of God, and all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't that, and these were, the sort of the early versions of the hipster churches that were independent, but essentially conservative, really, because the Jesus movement theology was framed by conservative people who embraced the hippies, that you know what I mean, but gave them they inherited a theological, ideological construct, and everybody had the same language. And so I just sort of let go of, because I figured I didn't have the whole picture, so I took this whole thing on. But after a while, and it took a while because I'm slow, and I sometimes don't know what my discomfort really is. You know what I mean? Like I feel things and I used to be way more internally. I didn't say much for a very long time. It was, so I'd wrestle inside and struggle and kind of not want to rock the boat, as it were. So I just keep quiet about things and mull them over. But after a while, I mean a few years, I realized that I was becoming actually more sort of fragmented in a bad way. I mean, I don't think there's such a thing as a cohesive human being, but you know what I mean? But pulled by things. And I'm like, there's something like not right here. And so, I'm trying to be as brief as I can. It sort of precipitated shifts in thinking and explorations, and I began to explore. And it was also precipitated because I was always interested. I mean, I got involved in the music business because I like travel. So then when I became, more involved in church and stuff like that, I became interested in what was going on culturally. And I'd always had a fascination with Russia. So I went to Russia, and I met Russian Christians and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, well, it's a longer story, but I did this massive television show in Russian, on Russian TV, for the European arm of Pat Robertson's network, when the Soviet Union, right before the Soviet Union collapsed. Yeah. That's a story that I don't really tell very much, but it was an interesting one, I think. But anyway, but going to other countries and sort of reflecting on how people lived and stuff like that, I was like, I've got to work this out. And the other thing was, a lot of friends of mine were walking away because it just, there's a point where the black and whiteness of ideology, you either capitulate to it or you just cut and run. And I was like, well, I don't know why, but there was a nugget of something that and it could have been stubbornness, because I can be stubborn as well. I just was like, this cannot be the only way to look at all of this there, because I was also, sorry, I've also been very interested always in what goes on within culture. And so looking around, I'm like, well, there are all these ways that people are thinking about life, trying to imbue it with meaning, trying to give it shape. And religion is obviously one of them. And in spite of the fact that people keep saying it's meaningless and pointless, it's still carrying on in lots of different ways. But traditional religions got some big problems, and I sort of realized that there were, I could see the writing on the wall, really, like down the road. although that's easier to say now in hindsight. But I just had a sense that this couldn't go on because the way the stories were being told didn't resonate with the world that I lived in. And I don't know if it's the kind of person that I am, but I'd always had networks of relationships. Even at the height of the sort of conservative Christian thing, I still had people that had nothing to do with it, that were involved in music or fashion or the arts and stuff like that. And there were all these other conversations. And I'm like, this can't get into that conversation. It only judges that conversation. But that conversation is really interesting to me. And that's a conversation that I think is important for all parties concerned. So I just began to look at, I sort of sat down again and went, well, what have I lost here? And what do I need to recover? And what do I need to let go of? And that was essentially—
It's kind of like in response to the fragmentation, you were looking for, how do I be able to cross these networks in a way that keeps me whole, or more or less?
Yeah, I mean, I you know, wholeness is a weird concept, but you know what I mean. But yes, but yeah, essentially, I was feeling stretched in the wrong ways by, you know, troubled, you know, anxious about this, and also talking about stuff that just really didn't interest me. And it was really funny. I went with some friends to see U2, and they played at Dodger Stadium, and it was that All That You Can't Leave Behind album. And it was when they were, you know, reapplying apparently to be the world's greatest rock and roll band. You know, I like U2, but I'm not the world's biggest U2 fan. But there's a period where I thought they were fantastic, and I think that was the period they were trying to repent of. But anyway, but you know, that tour, you know, the logo for the tour was this suitcase with a heart in it, and that album, you know, it's an interesting statement. All that you can't leave behind. It's one of those questions that piques my curiosity. Like, you know, we were talking earlier about the readers that you read, the way they frame a question just pings you. And it's like, so it's not what you're taking with you. It is, but it's what can you not afford to let go of? What do you need? And so I use that as a theological ramp for sort of going, well, what can't I leave behind in this conversation? And I ditched a whole lot of stuff. And the first thing that went really, and it was always shaky anyway, was a very sort of clear metaphysics. It was just like, yeah, never really did get that whole thing, just took it on. Well-meaning, understand where it comes from, but that's something to, you know, so I went, I'm going to put that aside. I'm going to address it because I think metaphysics is important to address, but it has to be overcome. You know what I mean? In a way. So and then I was like, well, you know, so community, ecclesiology, all of, you know, I started to break it all down, and so I went to a seminary to ask these questions, you know, and I went to Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, not because I knew anything about it, but I had another life, and it was close. So I went there, and I just wanted to ask all, and that's sort of how I started doing all that stuff. And the more I dug into it, the more interested I became in other ways of framing theology and life. And the more I realized that there's not much of life that really isn't a theological conversation, you know. But how I framed it is I think for me, ultimately, any kind of theology and any kind of theory of religion that you have it's got to be a theory of culture as well, and it's got to be a theology of culture. And so
Leslie Newbegin talks about this kind of crossing.
Yeah, and then and Mark Taylor talks a lot about that too.
Mark
You know?
C. Taylor, a good friend of mine. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was very you know, finding his work was like really helpful. You know, like resonating and stuff like that. And actually, it's really funny because I sort of didn't really know, I didn't know where to look, and I wasn't even trying that hard to look. I knew that a lot of the theological stuff that was available to me in the worlds that I was in was not that interesting to me. You know what I mean? That it was addressing worlds that I didn't inhabit. You know, so it's interesting and great, and you know, I'm not dismissing it all, you know, but it just felt like it was out of time, not timeless, and yet always applied to the current situation. And it felt to me like the present was kind of being held hostage to an ideological construct that was actually inhibiting a sort of flourishing. So I just started to go, well, I've always been interested in art and music. Those have been, you know, like cultural things have always been my primary sources of stuff. So I'm going to start thinking, I'm going to start thinking artistically about all this stuff. And I'm going to start reading more, more art theory, aesthetics, and that kind of stuff. And I sort of wound up, I don't know, I wound up with a lot of Italians, you know, I mean, Echo and Vatimo. And Vatimo is sort of how I found my way to Caputo, you know, all those, you know, you just put all those things together. But what I wanted to do, and also, you know, I was doing this in a lived way as well with a community. So, I mean, I was an Episcopal priest for like 10 years. I was a non-denominational thing, but then I moved through all of those things to these kind of deconstructed places where when I left LA, I had sort of two going. One was on a Sunday, actually in a Lutheran church, but it was built on this premise that it was liturgical in that it had a structure. There was music and a talk and conversation, but the music was not religious, and the talk was about anything to do with life. Because what I'd come to was one of the big problems for me with Christianity is its isolationist thing, where the conversation, everything gets turned into a spiritual conversation. Well, I wanted to turn everything into a life conversation where instead of, you know, like, you know, Christians go, oh, how's your spiritual walk or your spiritual life? Well, I don't think there's such a thing. There's a life. And that life is made up of all of the things that interest you. But I don't think it's exclusively like binary, like it's a spiritual life, or to me it's life, and actually it's a material life, it's a physical life. The spiritual aspect of that is a kind of numinous guessing game. You know what I mean? It's abstract, you know, like you know, for a lot of my experience with Christianity, you know, the prioritization of the inner life and the afterlife, whereas I was more interested in this life. And, you know, and I still have issues with like interiority in that kind of, so I wanted to address that and go, look, we can talk about these things, but if we talk about it, and this week we're talking about Freud, and then maybe next week we're going to talk about David Bowie, and then, oh, we're going to talk about this guy from, you know, some Bible story, and somehow put all those things together. So I did that. And then I started this other thing called the Secret Philosophical Society, which was a kind of philosophical cabaret where we did it in an art space, and we'd pick a major like existential theme like sex, death, optimism. We did a thing called Overcoming Optimism. It was kind of brilliant. But and I would get friends who did different things to engage. So, you know, we did one on sex, and we had a gay porn star and a sex therapist and a burlesque dancer and a philosopher all talk about sex. And then the people that came, we always gave a ritual. So the ritual for that was you had to write down anonymously your secret sexual fetish. And then we read them all out loud as a way of basically saying we're all perverse. To be perverse is to be human. You know what I mean? But it was, and you know, so there was rituals, and you had to like write your name in blood and do absinthe at the start. I mean, it was pretty funny. But those were attempts to kind of have a sort of communal experience about life in a kind of richer way. So that's the very short, well, it's long-winded arc of that journey. So from kind of a sort of, you know, conservative character, very similar to Pete, really, in that he also was in, you know, a sort of charismatic conservative church doing all of that stuff, and then moved towards those things. And interestingly, I mean, and now I think there's just so much to say about religion and, you know, spirituality today, and I think it's a whole new ball game. So part of really coming back to London, even though it took me a while to sort of work it out, and there were sort of few reasons for that, was I wanted to kind of step out of some things and think about the next, because I've spent the last probably, I don't know, the last 7 or 8 years really thinking very intensely about the relationship between digitality and the spiritual, because I think, you know, Derrida's got that you know, that quote about the disconnect between our reliance upon technology and the space that it opens up for mysticism and magic. And you look around and you see what forms things take in the world today. Then you go, so there's a new conversation that again requires, I think, more reflection in general. And I'm interested in the sort of anthropological and sociological aspects of it as much as I am the practicing of it. You know, in some ways I could sort of lay that aside really and just be, but I also think that for me, it goes back to that whole thing of like, I just want to be less of an asshole today than I was yesterday. And there's something within the horizons of many things, but I think within the story of religions, there are things that are held there that are helpful to that conversation, really.